Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Mohamed Osman, a researcher in Human Rights Watch's Africa Division. Today, I want to talk about the unrest in Sudan. The ongoing clash involves the Sudanese armed forces and the rival Rapid Support Forces paramilitary group. Can you discuss what happened to get us to this point where Sudan now sees itself really at the verge of a civil war?
Yes, unfortunately, what have been seeing in the last days has been a manifestation of failing to address the root causes of violence and instability in the history of Sudan, especially, really post-independence. The last years witnessed a lot of shifts. Starting from 2019, when the protest movement ousted Sudan's dictator Omar al-Bashir, but unfortunately, we ended up with a civilian military power sharing transition that did not hold much, as well failing to address key issues around security sector reform and around accountability and justice. We had then the coup in 2021, where protesters made clear that there should be no return to the power sharing model as they see it, as emboldening abusive leaders over and over again. We ended up with a political process that was facilitated by international actors, notably the United Nations, the US, the UK, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia. Again, they decided to follow a path of political conveniency where these sticky issues weren't really addressed in a genuine manner. The two leaders ended up having a fight for power with Al Burhan, the army chief, demanding the integration of the rapid support forces. The last days and weeks before the fighting started, we have been seeing growing of tense remarks between the two leaders, but also movement of equipment and weaponry and tanks in Khartoum and other places. There have been a lot of warning signs. Many people would say there has been writings on the wall. I would say most of the people did not expect the scale of harm and damage that we have been seeing in the last days.
I want to talk about that. You said that people have seen writing on the wall, and in a piece for The Guardian, you called the fighting that broke out in the capital, Khartoum, on April 15th unprecedented. But you also lay out a history of violence there. What makes this unprecedented? What makes this different than any other time?
I think one of the key issues, it's important to reflect that Sudan has a long history of violence, in particular in the peripheries. Unfortunately, that history has not been integrated into any national political project, and the violence continued to a degree in these peripheries, even in the last weeks and months before the fighting in Khartoum. The key difference is that it's the first time to see two military forces, two government forces, fighting each other to that length in terms of duration, but also the intensity of fighting within urban structures and within densely populated areas. So that is why it's unprecedented. But of course, it comes at the heel of cycles and cycles of abuses by the security forces.
Both of the generals, who I do want to talk about in a moment, agreed to a transition back to democracy after that 2021 coup. Was that an empty promise? Where did that transition go wrong?
I mean, the protesters made it very clear. Their distrust towards the generals was not coming from a vacuum. They came from simply they were al-Bashir's associate for a long time. They overseen his abusive campaigns against protesters and against civilians. So when the transition started in 2019, there were already a lot of signs that the generals were just pushing back a lot on the reforms demands. And then similarly, when the coup happened, that was a clear indicator they're not to be trusted to sustain the transition. The political process that followed clearly sidelined these key voices, who've been continuously saying people who commit abuses, who want to wield more power, cannot be trusted to deliver justice on themselves. So it's really a lot of factual evidence was there in terms of why we cannot trust these military leaders. I think the key call now, we don't want to be in a situation of we told you so, but I think the key issue now for the international actors in particular is how to reflect on that and how to make it clear that this is a point of no return for these generals.
I do want to talk about the point of no return, but first, who are these generals? Can you give us more backstory here? They are SAF is led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and the RSF is led by General Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, also known as Hemeti. Who are they? What can you tell us?
So for Burhan in particular, there's actually very little information on his background, given that he, kind of progressed through the SAF institution over the years. The latest position he held under al-Bashir was being the chief inspector of the army. He had a record of operating in Darfur. He was the liaison officer between the SAF and the RSF, in particular in the war in Yemen. So this is the connection he had with Hemeti going back in time to working in Darfur and working in the Yemen war. Hemeti had much, well-known history of him moving from being a warlord to leading a paramilitary militia to having his forces recognized independently to be functioning under President al-Bashir. After the revolution, his forces became independent, and he was the leader of these forces by himself. He had definitely much more documented record in Darfur in terms of the human rights abuses. We documented that back in 2015. We also documented the role of the RSF in cracking down on protesters in Khartoum in 2019, where over 120 protesters killed. So there is definitely a longer record of abuses that is much known for Hemeti and the RSF. But SAF has its also legacy. I mean, they were the main force fighting in Darfur, Kordofan, Blue Nile, and by al-Burhan being the de facto leader of Sudan, he legally and politically has been responsible of a lot of the abuses that took place after the coup.
So would it be fair to say that this is really a personal fight that is playing out to be a countrywide clash?
I mean, it's fair to say that these two men with their ego had held the country at gunpoint. And I think that is very clear when we hear the remarks exchanged between them on media in the last days. It seems that, for them, the end goal is neutralizing the other or having the other surrendered. And in that regard, this is why it is very difficult to see an end to this fighting on its own merit, to see a political process settling the disagreements, given that it's really a fight for survival. So it's very hard to see that they can settle in for less.
That's interesting you say that. You've called this, so far in this conversation, they're at the point of no return. There's no end in sight. I do want to talk about where we are right now, though. We are in the middle of a 3-day ceasefire. So what do you think we should expect to see after these 3 days are up?
It's exactly a good point. I mean, I have been, bilaterally, and through our statements, talking to, diplomats and other actors of addressing the day one scenario we're seeing now, but really start thinking about the day after. And unfortunately, there is not much of thinking on that regard. I mean, the key message now is, civilian protection. But what's next? I mean, especially for regions that already had vulnerabilities, as I said, like Darfur or Kordofan or the Blue Nile or Eastern Sudan, the question is what's going to happen next? What's going to happen to the civilian voices in the country, the resistance committees, for instance, human rights defenders, the collapse of the health sector we're seeing now, the damage to the key infrastructures like water station, electricity stations, fuel stations, the airports, that happening was Sudan really was struggling economically as well. So reversing that harm would take a lot of time and energy and funding as well. So unfortunately at the table, the ceasefire seems not to be holding much. There are no consequences. And I think that what is missing now is to roll out consequences for those leaders for continuing to violate human rights, international law, continue to violate their commitments around protection of civilians. Because without that, I cannot really see these leaders with adhere to any positive sign of de-escalation.
Is that what you want to see from the international stage? Secretary of State Antony Blinken said the U.S. will work with its partners and Sudanese civilian officials to implement a long-term peace agreement, or a peace arrangement, rather. Do you think that's enough? What do you think needs to happen right now?
Exactly. I mean, I think what needs to happen right now is, from an international humanitarian law perspective, is seeing them refraining from any indiscriminate attacks that impact civilians and their infrastructures, especially hospitals, schools, ensuring safe pathways for people who want to be evacuated, whether they are citizens, whether they are aid workers, humanitarians, ensuring protection for hospitals, ensuring humanitarian aid is reaching to people in need. These are the key steps that have to happen right now, and they should be happening, literally from the April 15th. But there's not much happening at the moment. While doing this, we don't need to lose sight that this cycle, we've been there before. We saw it in the coup, we saw it during the transition, we saw it in 2019. So any peace arrangement have to prioritize that thinking that abusive leaders should not have a place in leading any progress towards peace and democracy. And I think that's the failure of international actors during the previous political negotiations, because they insisted on that metrics, sidelined the voices of saying no, and now they are bearing the brunt of it. So it's important to have a reformulation of the foreign policy that these actors are having on Sudan.
You said that this entire conflict happened because of the failure to address root issues, and that we've been here before and most likely may be here again if these root issues aren't taken. So what would you like? How would Sudan address these root issues?
I mean, at the heart of it is really the question of civilian oversight, how much a civilian leadership can have, a leverage and power to rein in military forces that for decades, they never really seen the civilians as entitled to overseeing them. And that was obvious, especially from Al-Burhan point of view, when the security sector reform discussions that emerged in the last weeks and months. He constantly rejected the idea that civilians would have oversight over military forces unless they're elected. Of course, that's, could raise a lot of questions. But really the issue, addressing these issues doesn't come with, dealing with the elites alone. If you have to really involve affected communities, resistance committees, internally displaced, human rights activists and experts, to make this process as inclusive and transparent, with the end goal of deconstructing the legacy of the abusive apparatus in Sudan, not to reinvent the wheel or not to maintain the status quo of sharing power between military and civilians as such.
Every headline for Sudan is it's on the brink of civil war, the ones that have come out in the past week at least, on the verge of civil war. Do you think that Sudan will descend into a full-out civil war anytime soon?
I mean, unfortunately, we have been seeing the conflict flaring up, to a different degree in different regions, the Western region, the Eastern regions, the other regions or parts of the country, they're still relatively safe, where a lot of people evacuated to, but there are no guarantees that would not happen, because, it really, again, comes to the fact that there are no guarantees, there's no pushback, there are no consequences for the violence to be contained. And with the existing vulnerabilities, I think the risk of Sudan descending into even further violence, call it civil war, is much, much more realistic.
Mohamed Osman, I appreciate you coming on today and providing your insights. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much.